Hello again. In our last video, towards the end, we were implementing if statements in order to provide the user with a hint. In our guess by number game, if they guess incorrectly, we want to give them a hint. And we wrote these two if statements in order to give those hints. Well, I alluded to the fact that there's more than one spot we could put these if statements. For example, inside of the else statement right here, we know the user is wrong. Giving them a hint right here in our code makes more sense than doing it outside of our code where we don't know if they're wrong or right. We got around that by strictly using greater than or less than in our conditions. But our code isn't quite optimal, right? For example, when the user guessed correctly, there's no need to check to see if we need to give them a hint. So this code here, Boolean condition on line 26, and Boolean condition on line 30 are executed regardless of whether they're right or wrong, which is not the most efficient implementation. So what we want to do in this video is talk about the idea of nesting conditionals, which really means we can place an if statement in the body of another if statement, in the body of another if statement, in the body of another if statement, and so on and so forth. Nesting. You can kind of think of this like the nesting dolls from Russia. With nesting dolls, you have a smaller doll and a larger doll, and in that doll you have a smaller doll in that doll, so on and so forth. And though this is restricted to essentially the smallest doll, with our nested if statements, we can nest as deep as we would like. One thing to keep in mind though, the deeper you nest your if statements, the more confusing they are in order to debug, in order to read, and in order to maintain. So we always want to try to keep our code as clean as possible while still being able to write code that implements the algorithm that we want. So let's take a look at our code and see how we can nest these if statements to be in the body of this else statement. Remember, the curly braces group code together to form a body. So if we move this code to be inside these curly braces, then this code will only execute when the body of the else executes, which is only when user's guess is not equal to secret num, making our code a little bit more efficient. So let's do that. Let's Control X to cut and Control V to paste. Now with gedit and an option we selected in the preferences, we can highlight matching curly braces. So if I click on this curly brace, it's going to highlight the matching curly brace, which means all of the code in between these two highlighted curly braces on line 19 and line 31 are part of the entire body of the else statement. Now, looking at the code, if we click off and we don't have those curly braces highlighted, it's hard to see that. The indentation level of these if statements is still in line with the if and else. So one habit that you'll also want to get into is indenting your code anytime that code is part of a body. That's actually exactly what we do with the body of the main function, right? We've got our curly brace that starts the body of our main function and our curly brace that ends the body of the main function, and we've been indenting all of the code in this body. Well, inside of our else and our if, we've also been indenting the code of those bodies. It's really easy for our eyes to spatially see these white spaces, these tabs. So let's do that with the code we just pasted in order to make it really clear that this code now belongs to the body of this else statement. Now this is much easier for our eyes to scan and see the membership of our statements to the different bodies. As you start to nest if statements, one thing you'll want to keep in mind is the deeper you nest, the more you'll have to indent. If you find yourself indenting code like way out this far, I would definitely take a step back and think about, is there a better way to solve this? And in many cases there are, and we'll learn about defining our own functions here in the near future, which can also help keep your indentation levels reasonable. But for now, all of the code we're writing is in the main function. So let's go ahead and save, compile, and run this. Guess correctly, make sure that still works, guess high, and guess low, and make sure that that still works. So the functionality of our program did not change at all by nesting our if statements. This is a small example, the Guess My Number fun game, but in the future you will see some larger examples where you will need to nest your if statements or your if-else statements in the body of other if statements or else statements in order to solve problems. But here we didn't have to nest it, but we know it makes our code a little bit more optimal and a little more readable because we're writing code that is close to the code that makes the most sense for it to be near. The last thing I want to mention in this video is the relationship between putting an if statement inside the body of another if statement or inside the body of an else statement actually represents a logical and relationship. In the notes for this video, if you head down to the bottom, I have a little statement about trying to collapse Boolean conditions when appropriate. For example, in this little snippet, I've added some code to our Guess My Number game where I'm restricting the number of guesses that the player can guess. For example, they only get to make 3 guesses and then they can't guess anymore. So here we have if players guess not equal to num to guess, which is like our secret num in our code. And then inside we have a test to see if the number of guesses remaining is greater than 0. And we'll say you're wrong, but you get to try again. So this is another example of a nested if statement. This if statement is in the body of this if statement, which means the only way this cout will execute is when player's guess is not equal to num to guess and, emphasis on the logical and there, num guesses is greater than 0, which means you could collapse this nested if statement into a compound logical condition, which is here. So as I read this out loud, you can see it's translated right here into a logical and operator. So this code will also run exactly the same, no functional differences here, but this is another way that you can think about nesting if statements as being logical and operators, and you can keep your code from getting really, really deep nesting and really, really deep indentation.